think you mentioned America as being an example of one of the three kind of true democracies in the world. And I would just like to dispute that or to question that for a second in two ways. The first of which, when you vote in America for a representative, maybe not for a president, but for a representative or for a candidate in the primary, you're more likely to have a diversity of choices, a diversity of programs, which might give you more choice than you're initially suggesting from your answer to the previous question. And I guess the second thing is even though our rights come from this kind of democratic ideal, even though we have a constitution and the Bill of Rights kind of coming from this idea of two-thirds majoritarianism, there is a certain amount of liberty which seems to be protected by the democratic ideal, which I think you argued couldn't be protected by the democratic ideal, having the cake and eating it too. And I was just wondering what you thought of those considerations.
Well, I agree with what you said, because what you said is not what I said. And in other words, I never said that America was a true democracy. I said that America is one of the three countries that I mentioned that has a true democratic culture. It's not a true democracy. I mean, when implementation of democracy kicks in, whether the electoral system and so on is, more or less democratic is something that we can discuss. But I think that America, more than, say, France or Germany and so on, has really a culture of democracy. I mean, witness the Constitution that hasn't changed for, since it was first established, for 200 years. I think it's a record amongst, modern democracies and so on. And with the exception of this country, which doesn't have a constitution. And there is a true sense of, founding fathers, a culture of legitimacy. Government is legitimate in America, whereas in Italy, in France, in Spain, in Germany, and so on, revolutions, changes in constitution, and so on, shows that governments have a problem of establishing their legitimacy. That's what I meant.
Just to follow up on that, though, because that strikes me as being quite contradictory with one of de Tocqueville's big, defenses of America is its democratic culture as an engagement. The people are engaged in their politics rather than just being passive. So I mean, doesn't that show that to some extent it certainly is compatible to, have a democratic culture alongside, a truly democratic culture alongside, norms of classical liberalism?
Yes, I think that Tocqueville was right, and it still shows today. I mean, Americans have a democracy, and there is a lot of involvement of people, more than in most countries, in their community, in charities, in civil activities of all sorts of kind, and in business, and so on. But the thing is that where the reconciliation doesn't take place is precisely in the sense that more and more people realize that what Washington is doing is actually trying to crowd out the civil, the civic involvement of individuals. And last example is Obamacare, and where, now all these sort of individual projects that people may have concerning their health and so on is crowded out by a government decision. And so I think that is where there is now more and more conflict. It was not so apparent at the time of Tocqueville, but there is more and more conflict between what people could do and what they can't do because government has simply occupied the terrain. And it is what Cameron is trying to re-establish. Everybody is laughing with the big society. And I think that it's interesting because I think that what is happening today is simply that governments will have to relinquish, will have to give up a lot of its activities simply because it cannot finance them. And the big problem for politicians is going to explain to people, it started in Greece, started in Spain and so on, to explain to people, look, we can no longer deliver. What are you going to do? And people will say, well, we will do things. No problem. We are very creative as individual beings, but we no longer need you. So how do you, when you are a politician, how do you come out of this dilemma to say, we can't do it, and we want to stay in power? So I think that is, in the next 10 years, we are going to see a lot of interesting political discourses being, aired on television and on the internet and so on. Yes?
You said at one point that a gun could be used offensively, whereas a ballot could never be.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if you really think that there can be no such thing as sort of voting in self-defense. Even if someone takes your point that, voting legitimizes the current system and is sort of buying into the whole democratic myth, do you not think there is a certain sense in which it's okay to vote for a party which is sort of explicitly trying to disassociate themselves from these sort of policies, or do you think there's no way that could ever happen?
In a referendum.
In a referendum or in a general election, just for instance, yeah.
But whether it is in referendum or general election, I mean, if your vote was the decisive vote, maybe. But if you participate, the chances of this in modern democracy in a country like this country is virtually nil. So what you are doing by participating in the vote is to say, I consider that this vote is legitimate. And if a result is against me, how can I then criticize the result? It is the analogy that I took of the gambling table. I mean, if I sit at the roulette and I play red and black comes out 25 times and I lose all my money, I cannot say, well, give me my money back because I didn't want to play. It's not a game I wanted to play. But that's exactly the game that you participated in. So you cannot criticize, the outcome. I think there was this gentleman and then, yeah.
I was wondering, what do you think is the right type of government in a country like India where there's so much diversity? Unless you divide them into little kingdoms with homogeneous populations. What do you think is the right sort of government, if not democracy, in a country like India where there's so much diversity?
Well, division has already taken place in Pakistan and then Bangladesh and Kenya and and Sri Lanka and so I think that if you have a government that does virtually nothing except protecting individual rights against, theft, rape, murder, and so on, which everyone agrees on. I mean, whether you are Tamil or Bengali or whatever and so on, people don't want to be mugged. They don't want to be raped. They don't want to be assaulted. They don't want to be, conned and so on. So everyone will say, fine, for this government. Now, if this government does that effectively, it doesn't matter whether, the members of government are Muslims or Hindi or, whatever, and so on. So where it becomes a problem is when the government starts saying, oh, we are going to do something about education, or we are going to do something about, you name it. So I think the less the government governs, the more adhesion it will have, the more support it will have, because people will see that what it does is what everyone wants. That would be my take on it. You want to say something?
Yeah, I think I just want to press Dan's point a bit harder. If you're going to use that analogy of the gambling table, the thing is that my chips are on the table whether I cast my dice or not, and so I've got a stake in the game, even if I opt out of the decision process. It's not like if I withhold my vote, that I don't have to pay taxes anymore, or that I'm not subject to the will of the others who did vote. So I think maybe Dan's right to suggest that I find myself in a country that's ruled that way, and I'm invited to cast a vote towards one party or another. I don't see that I am immune from what happens just because I don't vote. still lose all my money on the gambling table even if I don't try to play it.
Yes, that's right. But I mean, again, what I was saying, if your vote would change the election, then, of course, it would be worth putting it, because you know the result. But my point is more a moral point. Your vote is not going to change anything. The majority will decide whether you vote or you don't. But by participating in the vote, you deprive yourself of a moral high ground of saying, I didn't vote for this. I didn't participate in the regime that allowed Hitler to come to power, that allowed the Islamic Front to come to power, that allowed this government to do this, this and the other, go to war or whatever. I was out of this. Now, you could say, as Sartre said, Camus, never wanted to have anything to do with the Algerian war. And Sartre said, Camus doesn't have blood on his hands, but he doesn't have hands. So it is a bit, my moral high ground would be to say, yes, I prefer not to have hands. I prefer not to have voted and not to be complicit in the result. Albeit it was not the result that I wanted, I still gave credibility and legitimacy to the result. Sorry, it's a convoluted answer.
Could you not easily say that by not voting you're legitimising the situation because you're not voting saying you don't want to change, it, that it can be interpreted as you're happy to accept what everyone else forces upon you, whereas voting is your chance at resisting and changing it?
Well, if you say that you are a Democrat and you don't vote, then effectively people would say, right, you accepted the result, whether you voted or you don't. But if you claim that you are against the very process that will allow whatever party to come into power, then you re-establish yourself morally.
What if it were a choice between, why didn't you vote for a Libertarian Party? A party that stood for not democracy?
Well, that would be the absolute contradiction, to say we don't want democracy and we are going to field 200 candidates at the next election.
That's what UK do in the European Parliament.
Yeah, but it's the same. I mean, it's all part of democracy. So, yes, you want to say.
I don't understand something about what you've said. You've sort of said the government, a democratic government, it arises to sort of manage conflict in society, and by voting for it, you legitimise it having this monopoly on violence. And then you say that, what we really want is to reduce conflicts in society, which is created by this sort of 50% referendum rule. What you want is to be able to self-select into much smaller communities where you can, choose how you live and what you do. What's going to prevent the cause that led to a democratic government arising? There's all these competing communities. And you mentioned Pakistan and India. Now they've had a war. What's going to prevent this demand for government not arising on a much bigger level once you get rid of this democratic government on a smaller level? It seems to me that you're proposing a solution that just reopens the problem that democracy was meant to solve.
Yes, and didn't solve. I mean, democracy solved a lot of problems. I think it was a great step forward in history. Exactly like serfdom was a great step forward if you look at slavery that existed before. But I think that we've come to a point where we can move to the next stage up and abandon democracy because it is not working, at least my analysis, which clumsily I try to defend here. Democracy is not working, and I think that what will work is a breakdown of the functions of the state into independent agencies.
Okay, but you said that when you exercise your right to vote, what you're really doing is you're telling other people how you want them to live.
Yeah.
Now, if you remove the democratic process, that's only going to happen at a larger level. That's, you know, you've got these Tamils, you mentioned Sri Lanka with the Tamils. Now, one of the causes of that war is you've got one people telling other people how to live. So when you evolve all these functions of democracy into smaller levels, you're only going to have communities, different communities. You mentioned at the end you can choose to live, you can self-select into this like libertarian society or this communist society or this other type. You're only going to get these communities battling it out and trying to, you know, it's this. If you said it's voting is a way to tell other people how to live, you're only going to get communities trying to naturally, part of the human tendency, if you like, telling other communities how to live. And maybe with the exception of the libertarian community, you know. So I don't see how it's a better solution to what happens at the moment. And the point that I was going to make is if you participate in the system, the democratic system, by fielding candidates who say suggest we're only going to agree to things that are agreed on like a consensus, you can at least limit the damage democracy does, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, the point I was trying to make is to create a division between liberalism, in other words, human rights, and the democratic process. If you have human rights, then people can organize themselves, provided, and I said that you may disagree with a proviso, which is that the mind that would say we would benefit if we enslave people, if we force them to live the way we live. I think that more and more people realize that when people are coerced, they are not very productive, they are not very cooperative, and the cost of coercing them is very high. So if you accept that proviso, then a community could be a communist, could be whatever, Muslim, Catholic, Britons and Basque and so on. But they will say, if somebody is Basque and says, I want to live in Paris, I don't want to be a Basque, why would they force that person to wear a beret and to play whatever it is they play, and JLI, I think. So, no, I don't think so. And you may have, religious fundamentalists who will say, if we force them to live, then, their soul will go to paradise and so on. I think that most theologians will say that God, Allah, and so on, don't like people who have been coerced to live in a certain way and then claim their entry into paradise, albeit all their lives they thirsted, they aspired to, drink alcohol and do all sorts of things that religion forbade, and eat meat on a Friday as Catholics should do. Or maybe we can do now. So, yeah.
I think it's something interesting that I'd like to hear more about that was only kind of hinted at in your argument is how we transition from democracy to this kind of new, freer state. Is it something that comes about through revolution? Is it something that comes about through a natural process? Is it something that we're going to have to fight for? And I guess as a kind of extension to that, where and when can we expect to see it come about?
Yeah. No, I'm a Marxist, and I believe that Marx's analysis of history as a history of class struggle is absolutely correct. And I think that throughout history we have seen a class of slave owners with political power and slaves, and there was obviously exploitation of the slave by the slave owners. And you saw then a class of noblemen with political power and serfs who were exploited, and no question about that. And then you had the bourgeoisie, and there Marx missed something. He believed that the bourgeoisie had political power. And then he tried very hard to explain exploitation by, the surplus value, with all surplus value and so on, which in the first book of the Capital, he gave in 1842, he gave a first definition of the surplus value and so on, and he could never, really give a complete definition, a complete analysis of surplus value. He published, the Capital, the first term of the Capital, 1866, I think, and then Karl Menger published his Principle of Economics as Marx was writing the Capital, 1873, and Marx never wrote anything after that, except one book, one thing about the Commune in Paris, and then a year before he died, Marx wrote a book on Wagner. He couldn't finish the Capital, because I think, I would love that scholars, if you want to do an analysis of this, I would love that scholars explain why Marx, who obviously read Karl Menger, because he read everything, couldn't finish the Capital. And what I think is that when he read Karl Menger, and subjective theory of value and so on, I think Marx went, and that is so obvious. That is so obvious. And I think that what Marx missed is that there is a dominant class. There is a class that extracts the surplus value that we all produce. It is the class of state employees. They have the political power, as the feudal lords had the slave masters had. And they are the ones who blatantly, very openly, tax, everyone who produces something, and they live off it. And as Marx beautifully explained, how can a class, a dominant class, that numbers what? 15% of the total population? At least 20%, okay, the law of 80-20. 20% of the population. How can it maintain a subservient, an exploited class that doesn't rebel? Ideology. Ideology. And the dominant class of state employees produces education, produces all this sort of myth of public service and so on. We are only lording over you because you vote us in power. You give us power. You participate in your exploitation. This is, for a slave master, this is the best thing. The slave says, thank you, master, you feed me every day, you give me shelter. You sell my children, but what would I do with children? So, it's wonderful. Ideology works.
I think that subject is far more interesting, but than what I'm going to say, I think. But I still feel that you're not giving us an answer to the violence, to what happens when people having, government, whoever has the power now, does no longer have the power, so we take that away. And each of us, we're no longer voting, we're no longer using our vote as a defensive gun, if you like. But some people are going to use an actual gun to coerce or to acquire resources, because we live in a world of finite resources. We can't just choose things, we can't wish things just to be, we need those resources, and there are going to be conflicts over those. So, I think, gentlemen said it earlier, the system right now preserves a measure of non-violence over what we have, of non-physical violence. And if you take away this apparatus of the democratic state, this ability to remove your overlords, with the ballot, what are you going to do in its place? Now that we no longer live in the 19th century where arms involves muskets and it involves and mass violence is much more easily perpetrated by a small number of people, and all those sort of variables. How do you deal with that when people want power, people want resources, and they take it from other people?
Yes, That is a question, and I would say two things. If we liberate ourselves, I mean, if a society that liberates itself and say, you know, minimum state, really, truly minimum state, would it be worse off when you consider the last 200 years and what states have done? You know, world wars and war today. I mean, this state is, you know, the state we are in is waging 2 wars right now. Could it be worse?
But if I may, not between democracies. The history of the democracies going war with one another is, I mean...
Yeah, but that is... Romans,
yeah.
Romans with a U, not no, but argument, and even Fukuyama and so on. It's never been challenged. I think the reason why democracies never went to war against one another is probably coincidental more than because we were democracies. But but fine. I mean, I think the democracies wage violent wars, probably the most violent wars in, you know, the last 200 years. So the fact that they didn't get to war against one another means that either every country in the world will become democratic, and then the violence will be only inside democracies, like extortion, like, you know, these sort of things. Or, if you don't believe that every country will become a liberal democracy, you will continue to have war, as long as you have states. Because who else will wage war? And if you have a society, I mean, war is very costly. You may have street gangs, you may have violence between gangs, but fine. I mean, you know, we are in a situation where, how can I express this? I think that it's difficult to explain that there is a transformation of conscience. And to go back to the Marxist argument, which I not completed, I think that what Marx says is that it is technology, it is the economics of society that govern the politic of society. And the transformation of politics comes because of a transformation of the economy. And there is obviously, in the last sort of 20, 25 years, I think you will agree with me, a huge transformation in economics. I mean, moving from an industrial to a post-industrial society. And more people are part of this post-industrial society. Countries that were colonies 40 years ago, countries that were completely outside the world of economics, as we understand it, the free market economics, are now getting inside it. And this has a huge transformation on the mentality of people, on our mentality. I mean, we have seen, and I think it's been in our psyche, I think it's been an enormous moment when we saw the planet, we saw our planet photographed from, you know, beautiful photographs of the planet taken from outer space. So we are sort of envisaging the world, and this is what the green movement is telling us, and so on. We are one planet. And this transformation of economics is transforming our vision of politics and our vision of violence. You find very few people in the world today who would say war is good. Even Bush didn't say that. Whereas, when I was born, war was something necessary. War was something good. War was something that, you know, could increase your country, could bring wealth to your country. Of course, there was a cost, but it was good for the soul of the country. Nobody says this today. Not even in the places in Africa and elsewhere where war is rampant. Because it is more like, you know, street gangs in here. So the ideology of war has been completely discredited. And I think that is terribly important. And that delegitimizes the state. Because one of the reasons to have state is to protect the country from an invading army. But where is the invading army?
I think perhaps on that. Oh,
Yes.
sorry.
Yeah. The problem I see with your ideology is that this will only work if we are either living in isolation or if everybody agrees. So you say the group of communists say we'll form society, we share the same beliefs, and we will live in that society. And the rest of the world, provided they don't target you or they don't want to take over your resources, that's not going to work. And looking back at human history, given that we are inherently barbaric and selfish and greedy, I don't see how it's going to work. And democracy is something that provides a compromise. And if we are going to, get out of the system, then that probably be the end of civilization as we know it. And this is what provides compromise. And if you want to say live in a communist society, you're still dependent on your neighbor not attacking you or not coming to steal your resources.
Yes, but is that true? I think that I believe that you could reverse a proposition, and that a country that would liberate itself and say, we don't need all these people, we don't need this government, we don't need all this. That country would show such an example, would show such growth, would show such creativity in the arts, in business, in charities, that it would become a magnet for the rest of the world.
Well, that's not necessarily true, is it? I mean, we feel that our ideology is great, but then there is a section of people who feel their ideology is great.
Yes.
And even though the Western world is so well off, the parts of Middle East don't share our ideology, or the Islamic parts of the world say that this is the best, even though we live better off than them. They don't necessarily agree with us, and for them their holy book is the word they go by, and they subjugate their women, and even though we feel that that's not necessarily good, and that's not good, and the women here live well off, the women there, they agree that this is our holy book and this is how we're going to live. So people are not necessarily going to agree, even though you say that we live well off.
You see, I agree with you that prosperity is not necessarily the highest value. And I fully understand people who say, I don't want to become rich, I'm not really interested in having free televisions and so on. And I don't have one. So I think that I accept that entirely. And I've a lot of consideration for this. It doesn't mean that, especially people in the Middle East and so on, they're not going to invade us in England. They may create a bit of a problem, but if you equate...
That's because they do not have enough power to do that. If they do, then they will. I mean, that's what Christianity did during the Crusades. And if Islam had the power to do that, then they'll also go around spreading Islam. That's because that's what they want to do. Because we're more powerful than them now, they don't do it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they cannot do it in the future.
But there are two things. Why are we not powerful? That is a big question. Why, in the 500 years, the last 500 years, this great civilization has suddenly stopped producing? Not a car that you can drive, not a drug that you can, that will heal you, not a plane that can fly. Nothing has come out from 1 billion people. Now why? I don't have the answer to this. I mean, it's a great problem.
Because as humans, we are not evolved enough. We still live with our delusions. We are not evolved enough to get out of them. And till we do that, what you're saying is not going to be possible.
Well, yes, but can they do this? Can they suddenly become the great civilization, the great culture that we were 500 years ago, without changing all what you have ascribed to them, which are the things that we don't like about that part of the world? subjugation of women and you know, fundamentalism and so on. Can you have a society that is creative, that is productive, a society that evolves, if you maintain half your population on the veil, and if you don't allow people to read books, to, you know, connect to the internet, to watch porn, and to do all these things that, you know, human beings do. So if you are, you know, a Taliban society, you will never have your weapons to invade the world. You will remain Talibans in mountains and so on. It's a choice. And I'm ready to help everybody who wants to leave that, you know, part of the world and come and study here and live elsewhere and so on. That's what we should do. The other thing, of course, is that, very unfortunately, we, especially the Americans, have created a situation where it has become impossible for people in that part of the world to embrace Western values without betraying their fellowship, their friends, their family, their clans, their own culture. I take this analogy. Assume that you are a lover of Wagner. You love Wagner. And this is 1940. And you have been appointed as the governor or dean or whatever it is, director of Covent Garden, the opera. 1940. Can you stage a Wagner opera at Covent Garden in 1940? Of course not. Politically, it would be, this man is a Nazi. So what happens today, because of Bush, the war and so on, if I am an Egyptian, a Syrian, an Iraqi, and I am deeply concerned about Israel, about, you know, my country being attacked, you know, the West and so on, and I would like to read, I would like to become a Westerner. I love Iran. Iran is a Jew. I love Rothbard. Rothbard is a Jew. I love Frédéric Bastiat, but he is a liberal. And he is a proponent of all what our enemies are, you know, advocating. It becomes very difficult for me to be a Westerner, to wear Western clothes, for, you know, my wife to wear miniskirts and so on. Because they feel, rightly or wrongly, probably in a way rightly, that they are at war with the West, and therefore adopting the mores, the customs, the way of life, the literature, the culture of the West, becomes a kind of betrayal, especially in societies where loyalty to the group is more important than the rule of law. I don't know. Yes?
I really just want to clarify that you're sort of chicken egg thinking in the right order. So, if we say, because I assume part of your philosophy is that the state itself will wither and die and that communities will. Is that accurate? I mean, because I don't see how you have a, you say a minimal state, but I mean that still involves an element of control, right? Even if it's, you know, even if you delegate only defense to the state, you then have to have an element of enforced cooperation to maintain a cohesive defense, which, well, I mean, maybe you can dispute that, but let's say, I think what you were saying earlier about if you don't educate your children, then you will not have the capacity to wage war because they'll be ill-educated and therefore cannot produce the weapons, so on and so forth. So, I mean, let's say there is a group of people and they choose to, you know, raise their children in a certain way. You obviously have been raised and are a product of your environment, your pedagogical environment, your society, same way that I am. But a child raised in a different environment, a very, very different environment, perhaps in a strict Islamic theocracy or whatever it might be, will have a completely different view of the world, and absent a state to maintain a standard of education, to impose restrictions on what a family or a community can or cannot do to that child, you know, you could get a very strange, different group of population arising as a result of something like that. Now, you say, okay, they have not been
them you're thinking, if they were raised in our tradition, our, you know, our positive tradition, they will also, it will follow that they will have a philosophical approach that says, okay, we can't make war because war is bad. They'll have a rational approach to the market. So you're saying all those things will follow? Yes?
Yeah, I mean, it is, you know, evolution of history. I mean, 600 years ago, people in this country and everywhere thought that it was perfectly natural to have slaves. It was perfectly natural to have absolute kings. It was perfectly natural to, you know, kill people who were of another religion. It was perfectly natural that women would not have the same rights as men. It was perfectly natural that people born from a certain lineage would have a different juridical status as people born as sirs and so on. No problem with that. Very few people questioned it. And, you know, it took, what, 200 years to move forward and another 100 years to move, you know, to another stage and so on. Why do we believe that the stage we have reached today with nation states and democracy is the pinnacle and there is no future? I see that things are moving, and things are moving very rapidly. And that, as I said, that was my theory, that what created the ideology of democracy was really two recombined ideologies of nationalism and socialism. Now, to me, nationalism died at Auschwitz. The idea that you could have one state, one people, on one land, one government, one people on one land, ein Reich, ein Staat, ein Reich, ein Führer, is, and Volk and Führer, is something that can no longer exist today. Because you cannot have a homogeneous population, even in Japan. So you will have communities that will say, we are not entirely part of this. We don't speak the same language, we have different traditions, we have different ways of doing things and so on. And you have to deal with this, and you have to accept it. And so either you are going to expel them, you know, which is Bosnia and all these horrible things, or you are going to learn to live with them. And if you start accepting this, and if you accept that socialism is not viable economically and so on, simply because of globalization, simply because for, you know, I don't know, 100 years, Bismarck, 120 years and so on, Bismarck realized that socialism was real. Socialism, he was the first, you know, leader who said, gosh, there is going to be a revolution. And he said the way to stop it is throw money at them. People don't make a revolution when they have their stomach full. So, give them the money. Then, in 1917, and the storming of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, the rich people in the West said, he's right. This is real. These guys are going to do a revolution. So they went to the state and they said, tax us, pay the workers. And then in 1945, when the Soviet divisions were on the Elbe, 300 kilometers from Paris, from France, they said, gosh, beverage plan, social democracy, give them even more money. And then in 1989, the Soviet Union crumbled. So the rich people said, okay, no revolution, that's fine. We are moving our factories to China and elsewhere. And the state turned to them and said, well, hang on guys, we have a lot of commitments here, pensions, NHS, things like that. If we can't tax you, how are we going to pay for all this? That's your problem. but I'm moving my factory to Malaysia. So suddenly the collusion there was between the rich people and the government, the ruling class. That collusion, that alliance, is breaking apart. And there will be less and less money to tax, and more demands from governments. Something is going to break. So there has to be a rethink of democracy, of the system we are living in, and so on. And I believe that it's not going to be national, and it's not going to be socialist. It's going to be something different. I cannot exactly tell you what, but you can be sure that nationalism and socialism are dead.